So, back in 2001, when dinosaurs ruled the Earth, a game studio in the Czech Republic called Bohemia Interactive released a game called Operation Flashpoint. It was a military sim, and back then it really didn't have much competition in its genre, being released alongside Steely Wheely Automobili, How Badly Mars Sucks, The Adventures of a Constipated Man, and not actually a Halo but a series of anti-organic intergalactic superweapons poised to wipe us out. Spoiler warning! So what Bohemia was bringing to the table was really something new. This was a game that focused on providing as realistic a military experience as possible, and told the story of a sudden and localized fictional conflict between the forces of the United States and the USSR in 1985, from the perspective of a series of unimportant soldiers on the islands of Everon, Malden, and Golgajev. Bohemia decided to forego a lot of the more traditional game elements that players were used to up to that point, focusing instead on immersion, removing things like health bars, invisible walls, and scoreboards. Your character couldn't even jump. You could only vault awkwardly over low objects like you were a hippo carrying a sofa or something. You'd become exhausted after even a short amount of time running, and in combat you were practically made of glass. One bullet fired from either side and you were fucked. One stray grenade and you were fucked. A small songbird lands on your finger and you were fucked. Despite the difficulty level, there were limited saves, and death would be frequent and often unexpected, and the game never held your hand, often keeping mission-critical information hidden behind the fog of war, as you would often be killed suddenly by a guy you never saw from a force that you never even knew about, for the game to drop you back onto a "you are dead" screen with some poetry about how much war sucks and how much you suck if you think it doesn't suck. It was unapologetic, it was bloody, and it was at times cruel. And as it happens, it's one of my favourite games of all time. At the tender age of 15, I sunk an embarrassing number of hours into this title, first in its campaign and then in the pre-packaged mission editor that lets you create more or less anything, from battles with 100 tanks versus 100 wooden chairs, to huge and complicated player-made campaigns. Both me and my little brother, who never beat me in the culling, shut up, ended up making huge and complicated custom campaigns that outshone the main campaign in their scope, and Bohemia gave you the tools to do that. But there are two core strengths about Operation Flashpoint that are very relevant as to why DayZ works so well. The first is that the game did not take place within restrictive levels, but on extremely large and open maps, where you could more or less go anywhere at any time, and where the edges of the map were basically just the ocean. You think the Battlefield games had large maps? Yeah. Wasn't even close. And these were not procedurally generated either. The maps were designed and crafted hill by hill, town by town, castle by castle. Okay, granted, there are like 4 castles, fuck you! And when you realise that you could climb every hill, explore every valley, and create enormous set-piece battles from even the most humble parts of the terrain, you'd realise that the possibilities were almost endless. Bohemia made the map their main character. The campaign's player characters were relatively blank slates. It was the map that you would remember most, the lonely pine forests of Everon, or the sun-baked Malden roads, or the rusted ruins of Golgajev, and this is a quality that has remained in the franchise even after it changed its name to Armour, and it's one of the foundations that DayZ rests on. The second core strength of the title is that Bohemia would make a habit of meticulously fleshing out even the smallest details in their game world, with regards to vehicles, weapons, and equipment. Even for factions you never really saw, they would custom design props and vehicles and even vehicle interiors. Just jumping ahead to Armour 2, this obsession would never be more apparent until you consider that they went to great lengths to flesh out the Russian faction, who didn't even feature as a principal enemy in the campaign. Seriously, for Harvest Red, the primary campaign of Armour 2 on launch, the main enemy are an insurgent group called the Jedaki. The Russians are never anything more than some vague presence somewhere up north, and I think it was the final mission in the game when I finally fought a group of Russians one-on-one, and it was like 4 guys in the dark, like you'd accidentally stumbled onto some dogging site. In the hands of a lazier developer, we would see unique skins, maybe, for these 4 guys, and then big invisible walls so you couldn't figure out for yourself that the Russians weren't actually real. But no, Bohemia put in the legwork to make infantry groups, specific textures, skins, Russian-only weapons, vehicles, and aircraft, knowing full well that players would discover them themselves in their built-in mission editor. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Bohemia continued to use these 2 strengths for the rest of their Milsim franchise. And in 2009, when Bohemia created Armour 2, they made a memorable map. Chernarus, a 225km square post-Soviet nation featuring pine forests, orchards, coastal towns, pine forests, open farmland, rolling hills, pine forests, and open oceans on its south and east borders. And then they continued their habit of creating thousands of weapons, tools, pieces of military equipment, cars, tanks, helicopters, pine forests, and planes that the modders were free to use however they please. They had once again created the map as a canvas, with a whole load of items to serve as paint on a harsh and uncompromising game engine, setting the stage for a modding community to do their thing. And that is exactly what they did. Now, we've all seen zombie games crop up before, and Arma 2 was to be no exception, but its implementation was particularly clever. You see, when playing a multiplayer game of Arma 2, the server would run a certain mission file with a set number of slots for players to occupy, each representing a role within a squad of soldiers. But the DayZ mod would load up a game of Arma 2 that was basically the entire map, and make each individual player the sole member of their own squad. This meant that they were all technically on the same side, but would have none of the icons to show where allies were. Skins were given a more civilian look and feel. The starting inventories were modified to include no weapons, nor any sort of radio or easy way of linking up. From there, a number of customized conditions would be introduced on every character, such as a hunger or thirst meter, which would need to be replenished by eating custom added survival items, which would be made to spawn at triggers at roughly 200 meters from the player, and a selection of Arma 2's vehicles would be scattered across the map semi-randomly. And then, a similar spawn radius was created for the zombies, in the form of retextured civilian models, which would follow crude and often hilariously flawed pathfinding as they would try to run within short range of the player and inflict damage by taking numerical chunks off of those artificial health bars, or even knocking the player down, with an added hourglass timer during which the player is completely helpless. And because the zombies would only spawn around the player characters, it meant that you could never really escape them. It was just something you had to manage. Also, if there were multiple players in one area, your spawn zones could overlap, creating a much larger concentration of zombies, especially in a city. Additionally, there were some nice creative touches, such as the screen shaking when you're in pain, or turning black and white when you're low on blood, or coughing loudly when you need antibiotics. But really, that was kind of it, with some clever logic attached to each player character and a radius around the players in which zombies and items would spawn. A very effective illusion had been created, one of an entire world overrun by zombies. There was no goal, no scoreboard, no endgame objective. The Arma engine made you as vulnerable as a child, and you started both alone and unarmed. Another key factor was iteration times. Your first try of DayZ would be very short and very confusing. You would spawn, get your leg broken, get beaten down by zombies. You would spawn, find food, get your leg broken, get beaten down by zombies. You would spawn, find food, find a crowbar, travel to the next town, get your leg broken, and get beaten down by zombies. Each death would become a learning experience as you steadily got better at surviving, learning what sort of items spawned around you and where, which buildings were dead ends and which ones you could hide in, and which areas of the map generally had fewer people. And it really worked. This zombie mod had done something that no other game had done before. It had replicated the brutal day-to-day survival in a zombie apocalypse. It wasn't that the zombies were an enemy you had to shoot, it was just something you had to endure for as long as you could, knowing that you would absolutely die. It was really just a question of how long you'd last, and it was a true water cooler game. Everyone under the sun had stories of encounters they'd had because other players could help or hinder you. You were all competing for the same resources. One moment you could be saved from death by a total stranger, or hunted like an animal the next. Even pure horror games had trouble competing with many of the moments in the DayZ mod. All of the predictable jump scares would be unable to compete with that chill that goes down your spine when you think you're alone in a forest and you discover you're not. Very shortly after its introduction, lots of new versions of the DayZ mod started to appear as people rapidly introduced new ideas. Server plugins could be added to trigger random events, such as helicopters crashing with supplies, or rescue planes dropping relief, or groups of AI bandits, or even surviving pockets of the military defending checkpoints and stash houses. And perhaps the most interesting idea, the ability to place down lockboxes and locked storage units to gather items in one location and keep them safe after you log off, protecting them with some basic walls and doors and other defenses, creating very rudimentary bases. This would allow you to set up and fortify a home pretty much anywhere on the map, any building that you could go into, or even just out in the middle of nowhere. It created a strong incentive to team up for mutual protection, and whilst many survivors continued to roam as lone wolves, the popularity of base building exploded as groups of people would pool their efforts to take over an area and defend it. The DayZ mod is like some fascinating social experiment. You would be dropped into a massive open game world with all of your current biases, prejudices, your optimism, your cynicism, and you're given free rein to do as you please, with nobody holding your hand, and you would more or less never play it the same way twice. So that's the DayZ mod. That's why it became popular. Some clever ideas that turned a milsim game into a fascinatingly immersive survival game, the likes of which we really hadn't seen before. So with this in mind, before we start talking about the DayZ standalone, let me first walk you through the DayZ mods themselves, because there was a period of about, say, 2 years or so, just after the arrival of the DayZ mod, that saw an explosion of creative energy, which was frankly fascinating. Continued in part 3.